On the first day of the week, when we were gathered together to break bread, Paul talked with them, intending to depart on the next day. And he prolonged his speech until midnight. If you ever think our sermons are long, okay, listen to this one. There were many lamps in the upper room where they were gathered. And a young man named Eutychus, sitting in the window, sank into a deep sleep as Paul talked still longer. And being overcome by sleep, he fell down from the third story and was taken up dead. But Paul went down and bent over him, and taking him in his arms, said, "Do not be alarmed, for his life is in him." And when Paul had gone up and broken bread and eaten, he conversed with them a long while until daybreak, and so departed. And they took the youth away alive, and were not a little comforted. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. You may be seated. Our kids can be dismissed. There's great things down the hall for them. To the rest of you, thank you so much for being here at the first service today. Where are my sleepers in the room? Sleepers? My people. My people. I love sleep so much. I am addicted to it. I do it every night. Sleep is so easy for me, I can do it with one eye shut. Yes. Jim Gaffigan talks about sleep being important to us, and he says sleep will make us give up any principle. And he says, like, let's say that you're invited to something. Hey, do you want to help the homeless? Well, of course. Yeah, I want to help the homeless. We're meeting Saturday at 9 a.m. 9 a.m.? Forget the homeless. Forget the homeless, right? They're homeless in the afternoon, too, right? Like, I heard that they were into brunch. Like, let's help them later. Getting up is hard. And then somebody asked my wife, Amy, if she wakes up grumpy in the mornings. And she said, no, I let him sleep and wake himself up. Then after you're awake, it is staying awake that is the difficult thing, right? There are places that you just don't want to fall asleep. There's one guy that became internet famous in the wrong way because he fell asleep on his second day on the job. This is him. This is all of his coworkers behind him. But it did not stop there, okay? The internet was challenged to Photoshop battle this guy following asleep. And the internet, say it with me, is undefeated, okay? And the internet kept its perfect record. Here are some pics, and there are hundreds of these. Here's Sleeping Beauty. Here is this particular, you got to look, because this is his face superimposed on everybody else in the background, okay? That is beautiful. Well done. This is the last, we'll call this the last sleeper, okay? The last sleeper. Mount Hushmore, how about that? All right. Here's the Pope. Is he praying? Is he sleeping? We don't know. We don't know. And then this one, some of the more seasoned humans will remember this cover. This is Nat King Cole. This is my favorite. That is the snooze luge. One more. The Nap King. Yes, the Nap King. Turns out that this guy was a good sport about all of those things, but you have to feel for that guy, right? And in the same way, we get to feel today for this guy that we've just read about named Eutychus. Of all the stories that Luke could have told us about, he tells us the story of Eutychus falling asleep in church. And that's the only reason that we know his name. So I want you to think about that. Like, when you're in heaven and you meet Eutychus, like, what are you going to say? Hey, nice to meet you. What's your name? Eutychus. Oh, you're that guy that fell asleep on Paul, right? And then fell out the window, right? And there'll be a long pause because he's so tired of this that he won't say anything, and you'll have to resort to, like, the Chris Farley inside of you and just go, that was awesome, right? And that's all you will be left. That's all you have. You don't have anything else. And can we make a pact just here, CCC people, okay, that when we get to heaven and we meet Eutychus, let's just not do that, okay? Let's know him for something else. Do some homework. Figure out his dog's name or something like that. Have some other common ground that we can talk about first with Eutychus, okay? Everybody, are we good with that? Okay, awesome. Eutychus might have been the first to fall asleep. He's definitely not the last to have ever fallen asleep in church. And over the course of church history, churches have come up with all sorts of ways to keep us awake. First, in the first centuries of the church, it was fiery, charismatic sermons. The early church fathers are famous for these. In the Dark Ages, it was cold and barren churches. Church furniture, even if there was church furniture, they didn't have any padding. People had to stand, the stone floors and the chilly air. The discomfort kept people awake. In medieval church times, churches employed ushers called church wardens. And church wardens would come to church with these long sticks. And when you started to doze off, they'd come and poke you with the stick. You want to bring that back? Anybody? In the Reformation era, people were used to the long Catholic Mass, and so Luther and Calvin went to shorter sermons so that people could stay awake. I'm glad we're still doing that. Say yes, yes. In colonial America, they 10x'd the church warden idea with a stick called a tithingman's rod. That sounds like what the mechanic tells you when he wants your money. Your tithingman's rod is out. But it was the same kind of stick as the church warden, but one end was a wooden knob, and the other end was a feather. And if you were a man in church and you fell asleep, you got the knob. If you were a woman or a child and you fell asleep, you got the tickle of a feather to stay awake. Clocks have played their part. Started actually with actual hourglasses. They would put them on the pulpit, and they would put the preacher on the hourglass timer. It moved to watches and clocks, of course. We have a clock on the back wall, and I have a watch on my wrist. And what do those things mean to a preacher? Answer, nothing. Not at all. And in our modern time, we have coffee, right? We've gone the coffee route. Clap for coffee. We've gone the LED wall route. We've gone the crank the AC route, to keep people awake. Does it? I don't know. Every week, if I'm being honest, I would be right there with you. The thing that saves me on Sunday morning is I'm the one giving the sermon, and everybody else is falling asleep to it. And so if you want the foolproof way to stay awake in church, preach the sermon. That works every time. And I have a sign-up list on the way out today that you can stop sleeping in church in that way. What Luke gives us here in this text is a little glimpse into how a church gathering would have gone in the first century. Acts 20 is only about 27 years after the death and resurrection of Christ. To some of you, that's such a long time, but to others of us, 27 years is nothing, right? And so just under 3 decades, the gospel of Jesus has begun to permeate the Roman Empire. The gospel is preached, and churches are formed around the Roman Empire. And Luke shows us just a little of what their meetings would have looked like in this text. He shows us when. Verse 7 says, it was on the first day of the week that they gathered. Why that day? The Jewish way of marking days of the week was from sunset to sunset, okay? So the Sabbath day was the last day of the week. If you remember, God created for 6 days, and then he rested on the seventh. That's the Sabbath, the last day of the week. And the Sabbath was what we would call from Friday at sunset to Saturday at sunset. So that's the Sabbath, the last day of the week. They met on the first day of the week. So the first day of the week would be from sunset on Saturday to sunset on Sunday, okay? Now, if you remember the Gospels, when was Jesus crucified? On Friday. He died, and before sunset that same day, they put him in a tomb. And in the Jewish mind, any part of a day was counted as a whole day. And so Jesus in the tomb on Friday night, Saturday, and Sunday morning, those count as 3 days in the Jewish mind. And so we say, well, that's barely 36 hours, but they would say 3 days. And day 3, Jesus walked out of a tomb, and it was the first day of the week. We call that Sunday. In the New Testament, it is commonly called the Lord's Day. John calls that in Revelation 1:10, he says he was in the Spirit on the Lord's day. It means the first day of the week. And so the regular day of meeting together for the worship of Jesus by the church was on the first day of the week, the Lord's Day, Sunday. In 1 Corinthians 16:2, it's even an assumption that is made by Paul. He writes and he says, when you come together on the first day of the week, he assumes that this is just the natural, it's understood that Sunday is the day that the church is going to meet together. And it was that way from the beginning. He shows us who. Verse 7 says, it's we who were gathered together. Who's we? Luke is the writer here. And we've talked before about there are certain sections of the book of Acts that are we sections. It's where Luke joins the group and he's traveling along with them and he writes literally, we did this and we did that. And so this is a we section. And so Luke is including himself in the we. Also included are all the people that he's just listed in the verse before this that we did not read today. And if you glance right up there, you'll see names like Sopater and Aristarchus and Secundus and Gaius and Timothy and Tychicus and Trophimus. And there's quite an entourage now that Paul has around him. And they're a part of the we. And the thing to note about that is how different those guys must have been from each other. They were from Berea, they were from Thessalonica, they were from Derbe, they were from Lystra, they were even from Asia. They could not have been more geographically diverse for that day and age, which also means culturally diverse. And so they're all different, but they have this one thing in common that brings them together. And I can go a step further with that. Also a part of the we here is all the existing believers in Troas that would have come to the church service that day on the Lord's Day. The one Paul singles out from this group is a young man named Eutychus. And the thing that you should know about Eutychus is that he's more than likely a slave. Well, how do we know that? Because his name was a very common slave name. And so likely he is one. Eutychus means fortunate. Or maybe some people called him lucky because that's what his name means. And I want you to pair that with where they are. Luke says that they're in an upper room. Likely, it's the upper room of a house, and this is an amazing house. This house has 3 stories to it, so it's just not, a one-bedroom, one-bath kind of thing going on here. Maybe think of the 3rd story as like a ballroom. Maybe that's a good equivalent. And because Luke says it took lots of lamps to light this place up. And so someone with the means owns a house like this, and he starts following Jesus. And then this person offers their place up as a place to have church. And there are some real Bible nerds out there who think they have figured out who this person is. They will point to when Paul writes his very last letter that he'll ever write. He writes it to his friend Timothy in 2 Timothy. And in that letter, he says, Timothy, I want you to stop at Troas. I want you to remind yourself, where does Acts 20 take place? Troas, yes, say yes. Yeah, good. Stop at Troas on your way to me. Pick up my jacket I forgot about that I left at the home of Carpus. And so, the church meeting in Acts very likely could have taken place in this guy's house. The name of the guy is Carpus, and maybe he had a spacious 3-story home, and that's where they met. No. So think about put all that together. Think about what that means. We includes people from every possible geographical location. We includes people from every possible cultural situation. We includes people from every possible economic position. We gathered together means all are welcome. And let me tell you, there wasn't anything like that in the first century, except for the Church of Jesus. The pagan religions were for certain segments of society. You didn't worship outside your group. If you were rich, you worshiped your God in a certain way, and that meant that the poor were excluded. Women weren't even considered in that day. To be a part of a mystery religion required an exclusive invite from somebody who was already involved. The worship of the Roman gods meant that you had to be a Roman. If you were Greek, if you were Scythian, if you were a barbarian, you were excluded. Local deities were tied to a regional identity in that day. So if you were an outsider coming in, you had to adopt the local customs to fully participate in worship. And so all that to say, there's all these barriers to the divine in this day, but those barriers get bulldozed away in the church of Jesus. Paul will write that all of us can be one in Christ, that we can all be sons of God through faith, that once you've put on the clothes of Christ in baptism, now there is no Jew, there is no Greek, there is no slave nor free, there is no male or female. All are one in Christ. And here in the church of Troas, as they get together on the first day of the week, we is such an amazing picture of that. Because you have a slave, Eutychus, and you have a master, Carpus, and they are both sitting at and sharing the same table. Only the gospel can do that. And at the table, Luke tells us why. When they met together that day, Paul was present, and Timothy would have been there, and all of those other guys that we just rattled off. They all could likely teach and preach, and likely they did all teach and preach as they traveled. And you can imagine these guys come to your town, this little town of Troas, and it would make sense if they are the reason that all the believers are getting together. Like, we need to go and hear what Paul has to say. Like, we probably won't ever get this chance again. And Timothy has a voice of an angel. Have you ever heard him sing? Oh my goodness, we got to go, right? And then they're taking up a collection to help the homeless. They're meeting at 9 a.m. Can we just do brunch? Is that okay? But no, that's not why they gather. Paul did preach. They probably did sing. They surely gave. By the way, the joy box is in the back. Woohoo! But none of that is primarily why they gather. What is? To break bread. That's what Luke says. It is to share in the Lord's Supper. It's communion. Jesus never really gave a command to us for when to do communion. Instead, he just offered it as a gracious invitation for his followers to share in. Paul in 1 Corinthians does put some brief instructions around it. He says, when you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. And so it's for followers of Jesus. It doesn't make sense to share in communion if you haven't given your life to Jesus in faith, which is expressed in repentance and confession and baptism. And he says, take it in a worthy manner. In other words, don't disrespect what it means here. Don't be flippant about the celebration that you're invited to at the table. Always keep in mind that it means that he died for you. This do in remembrance of me, is what Jesus says about it. And so what we see here in Acts chapter 20 is not an instruction about the Lord's Supper, but the importance of the Lord's Supper. It takes center stage as they gather together on the Lord's Day. And as important as preaching is, as great as it is to sing and to pray together, it's communion. It's communion that always drives us back to the reason that people who are so different and mismatched. That's the reason that those people can come together in unity of heart and purpose. And they can say to each other and to themselves, Jesus died for you, and Jesus died for all. And they do it in these little emblems that we share that Jesus left us with. And so this passage and a couple of others are why we here in this place, in this room. It's why we celebrate communion every week. And the frequency doesn't diminish the meaning. No. It's just the opposite. Communion every week is kind of like a picture of your loved one that hangs on the wall in your house. It never gets old. You don't put it away and then bring it out once a quarter. No, because the significance of the picture is in the person. It's in the person, and you love the person always more, never less. You would never say that a prayer is more meaningful if you save it for a special occasion. You would never tell your wife or your girlfriend that you're just saving the I love yous, right, so that they'll be more special. No, you'll get slapped for that. And communion is our chance to say to God every week, thank you. Thank you for what you've done in Jesus. I love you. And the more often we can do that, the better. And maybe once a week isn't even enough. Luke gives us the what here. This is what we've been waiting for the whole time, right? What happened at this particular service? Paul gets up to preach, and Paul didn't have a clock on the back wall or a watch on his wrist, and even if he did, we know what that means. Absolutely nothing, right? He just kept going. He goes until midnight. There was a man who always fell asleep in church because the preacher was so long-winded, and the pastor got agitated about that, and so he gave one of the deacons one of those Tithington rods to hit him over the head with every time he fell asleep. And the man dozed off, sure enough, next Sunday, and the deacon tapped him on the head and woke him up. A few minutes later, he started dozing again. He did the head bob thing, and the deacon hit him again, a little harder this time. And again, he woke up, but only temporary. And the third time, this guy falls asleep, and the deacon this time hits him so hard that he knocks him like right out of the pew, right onto the floor, almost knocking him out. But instead of responding in anger, this guy gets up and he says, "Hit me again, I can still hear him preaching." There are times that a preacher should just quit. Paul went until midnight. Would you give me this today? If you've ever complained that a sermon of mine is too long on any given Sunday, just keep in mind, I've never gone until midnight, okay? Like not once, not even close, all right? The telling note here that Luke gives us is that there are many lamps in use to light up the space where they're meeting. And those lamps would have been little closed bowls with a handle on one side and an opening for a wick on the other. And they would have been filled with olive oil. Just go try that in your own kitchen today and see what happens. Like you'll get a room full of smoke and not much light. But that was the best that they had. And it's the lamps that explain what happened next, because the room is more than likely crowded, maybe even shoulder to shoulder. Maybe they're packed in there like sardines, and Eutychus finds a place available by the window, and that would have been a huge, big opening that probably would have reached all the way to the floor, maybe, or just close to it, and they don't have glass in them, so it's just a ledge and shutters that are surely open at this time. And so he's sitting in the window with no safety features. He's probably come from a day of his slave work, and so he's tired, and it's stuffy, and it's in a crowded room, and maybe he's a little high from the lamp fumes, and it's getting late, and he does the head bob thing, and he sinks into a deep sleep. That's what Luke says. That's totally doable. You have been there. I have been there. One guy talked about a late night with friends, and they're going home, and he's in the back seat, and he's in a similar situation, and there's a half-hour ride home, and so he just crashes in the back seat. And so he's so out that his friends decide to make a contest out of him to see what would wake him up short of shaking him physically. And so they talk very loudly. They laugh. They turn up the music. They blow on his face. They turn the music up some more, and nothing worked. Nothing. They finally got home, and they had to shake him to wake him up, and they told him all that they had done, and he didn't remember any of it. All he remembered was the good nap that he had. And that's Eutychus. The word for sleep here is the word from which we get hypnosis. It kind of indicates to us that Eutychus fought it, right? Oh, we fight it. We try to hold our eyes open, but the stifling room, the hypnotic flames won out, and his eyes shut. He relaxed, and before anything can be done about it, he's out the window. He's 3 stories down. Something like that has a tendency usually to shut a service down. In almost 3 decades that I've helped with services in this room, I can think on about 2 fingers of times that some medical emergency has happened while we've been in a service. And in both cases, those people ended up fine, but in the moment, there's really nothing to do but just to pray and just send everybody home, like we're done. Paul doesn't have to do that. Everyone from the upper room runs down to where Eutychus is, And there he's laying dead on the floor, on the ground, and Paul bends over him. The ESV isn't really helpful here. The word means that he fell on him, not like a literal fall, but the idea is that he wrapped himself around Eutychus. It's the same idea as the prophets Elijah and Elisha. Both of them stretch themselves out on somebody who has died, and they're brought back to life. And that's what happens here. And after he does this, Paul turns to the crying crowd and he says, "Don't be alarmed, for his life is in him." And Luke doesn't tell us any more about the miracle, but he doesn't need to, because Eutychus is taken away alive. Everybody is comforted. And what happens next is probably the most appropriate thing that we could imagine. It says everybody goes back up into the room, and Paul conversed with all of them until the morning, but only after they had all broken bread together. And there's something just lovely about that picture. The something lovely is the common denominator in this whole text. Did you see it as we went through? When did they meet? They met on the first day. Have you ever thought about why that is? It's because Jesus walked out of a grave on the first day. For centuries, Jewish people set aside a day and worshiped God, and it wasn't the first day, it was the last day of the week. But suddenly, in the middle of the first century, a small group of Jews turn everything they've ever known on its head, and they begin to worship God not on the last day of the week, but the first day of the week. Why did they do that? There's no way that just happened. Something caused that. What was it? The resurrection. Who met together? People from every walk of life. How is that possible? How does the master of one house and the slave from another house, how do they sit down at the same table as equals? Here's the answer. Only by the blood of Jesus that covers both of them equally. The ground is level at the foot of the cross. No one is above or below another person. The resurrection is both the process and the proof. Why did they meet together? It wasn't to sing, it wasn't to preach, it was to break bread, to share in the meal that Jesus left for all of his followers to remember what he had done for them, to proclaim that the resurrection is not just a Jesus thing, but it is an us thing too. We get to walk out of our graves because he walked out of his. We get to proclaim his death until he comes. That's what Paul says. Resurrection. And what happened? It's so perfect. A church family here is gathered together because of Jesus' death and resurrection. They are interrupted by a death, and then there's a resurrection, and then they go and celebrate Jesus' death and resurrection together in the breaking of bread. And that whole picture tells us why we are here today on a Sunday. Why do we still meet together week after week? Like we're 20 centuries into this thing. Have you ever thought about that? At some point, shouldn't this get old? Shouldn't we get past this like some old club that we were part of? No. Because this isn't just a club. This is a gathering about dead people coming to life. It's about the one who makes life after death possible. And if he's not raised, then this is a club that we can just discontinue one day. But if he is raised, then we meet, and we meet, and we meet until he comes again. And every time we get together, we proclaim that he died and rose again and is coming back. And because he died and rose again, we will too. You do have my permission to sleep on my sermons. That's okay. If that's how I can serve you, great. Just don't ever sleep on the resurrection. Don't do that. It's the resurrection that keeps us awake. If you're serving communion today, you can get in place, and we have kind of crafted today to wind up in this most central part of why we gather together. If you've given your life to Jesus, we invite you to celebrate the resurrection with us today in the bread and the cup. And the way this will work, if you're newer with us, is a tray will come down your row, and the emblems are stacked. And just take a stack. The bread is on the bottom, juice is on top. Pass the tray on, and then would you take communion when you're ready too, okay? Martin Luther had a story about how on one occasion the devil sat upon his throne and he was listening to reports on the progress that some of his demons had made opposing the truth of Jesus and destroying the souls of men. And one demon came forward with his report, and he said, there was a band of Christians crossing the desert, and I loosed the lions on them. And soon enough, the sands of the desert were just strewn with these mangled corpses of Christians. And Satan said, so what? He said, the lions destroyed their bodies, but their souls are what I'm after, and their souls were saved. Another demon came up and with some great pride, he said, there was a boat out on the sea, and it was full of Christian pilgrims, and I sent a great wind against that boat that drove the ship into the rocks, and every Christian aboard was drowned in the sea. And Satan said, so what? Their bodies were drowned in the sea, but their souls were saved, and it's their souls that I'm after. A third demon came to give his report, and he said, for 10 years, I've been trying to cast a certain Christian into a deep sleep. And this week, finally, at last I have succeeded. And at that report, Satan stood up, and he cheered, and all the halls of hell rang out in triumph. If Satan can't put your hand to sin, then he'll put your head to sleep. And he might even prefer that. It is the breaking of bread together today that wakes us up. Resurrection makes us alive. Resurrection keeps us awake. Christ has made it so. Wake up, O sleeper, and rise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you. God, would you wake us up once again to the life that we have in your Son and our Savior, Jesus Christ. The cost to give us our life was his life. And let us never sleep on that. As we share these emblems today, we give thanks for his sacrificial death for us, that by his blood we can be made alive. And it's in the name of the suffering servant Jesus that we give you praise today. And all the people said,